I don't believe anywhere in hell 81 million people wanted Joe Biden to be president. But I do believe 81 million people wanted anybody but Donald Trump.
Stephen A. Smith just delivered one of his most brutally honest takes on modern politics, and it's causing waves. This isn't your typical sports commentator hot take. This is raw analysis that cuts through partisan noise. We're breaking down why this matters.
I believe that the election was legit, but not for the reasons one would think. I totally agree with you.
This nuanced position perfectly captures what many Americans actually felt in 2020. It wasn't pro-Biden enthusiasm, it was Trump fatigue. That distinction explains why Biden's approval ratings dropped so quickly after inauguration, despite winning decisively.
Because of that, it makes it because of that, it made it believable in terms of chaos, how much noise was being made. You know how people were like, you had people celebrating in the streets like, oh my God, we're finally free. You saw how exaggerative and how extra folks were when Trump was put out of office. So I'm saying that to me was emblematic of a large portion of America saying we wanted a break from all of that noise. That's why I believe the election was legitimate.
The noise was unprecedented. 24/7 cable news cycles, Twitter meltdowns every week, constant protests from both sides. Americans were genuinely exhausted by the political chaos. That exhaustion drove voting behavior more than policy positions.
You got to have an ID for everything. They ain't
Right.
Here comes the brutal honesty about Democratic hypocrisy. He's about to expose something Democrats desperately want to avoid discussing: the complete logical inconsistency of their voter ID opposition.
I mean, I do think it was ridiculous, but I also pay attention to Senator Fetterman, who's been supported for the most part of the Republicans. When Fetterman said, quote, he said certain things about the SAFE Act are a bit extra. Yeah, you got that.
The SAFE Act requires proof of citizenship to vote in federal elections. Fetterman calling parts extra is significant. He's a progressive Democrat admitting his own party goes too far opposing basic election security measures.
You essentially got to have a passport, and it is more difficult to get ID, under these restrictions that they're putting out there than it was before. So I do believe that, but that doesn't mean that both sides can't come together and resolve that in a damn day.
Polling consistently shows 70 to 80% of Americans support voter ID requirements, including majority of Democrats. This isn't a partisan issue among voters, only among politicians. The passport requirement criticism is fair, but basic ID shouldn't be controversial.
And for the Democrats to act like no ID should be required or whatever, like California and some of the stuff I learned about them and what they're doing under Gavin Newsom, that is utterly ridiculous. So you and I we ain't far off on that.
California under Newsom banned local governments from requiring voter ID even for municipal elections. They've also provided driver's licenses to undocumented immigrants while simultaneously opposing voter ID laws. The optics are terrible.
What I'm saying is we can point to things that the Republicans do, the conservatives do, to position themselves for the same thing. For example, when you're redistricting in Texas, for example, and other places, you're doing that because you want to position yourself to get most votes.
Absolutely.
This is politics. This is politics.
Absolutely.
So in other words, we can't hate on one side for coming up with a mechanism, you understand, to curry more votes in their favor.
He's absolutely right. Both parties manipulate electoral rules. Republicans gerrymander districts, Democrats oppose voter ID. But there's a difference. Gerrymandering is process manipulation. Voter ID is basic security. One protects integrity, one doesn't.
Let me tell you, because you left out something that's very, very important, Anton. When you in New York City and you need an ID to shovel snow, but you fight. You talk about telling on yourself. Mom Donnie and the Democrats. It just went out the window. You fighting for the SAFE Act not to exist, but in the same breath, you require an ID to shovel damn snow. That argument went out the window for them.
New York requires ID for incredibly mundane activities: getting library cards, buying alcohol, entering city buildings, even registering for recreational sports leagues. Yet opposing ID for voting, the logical inconsistency is staggering and indefensible.
You use the word disappointed. Nah, bro, I'm scared. I think New York is going to be an unmitigated disaster. I'm scared as hell. I already moved out the state, bro. I already bought a house in Florida. I ain't gonna lie to you. I already bought a house in Florida. I'm like, hell hell with this. This is an absolute mess.
When prominent figures actually relocate, not just threaten to, that signals real problems. The Florida migration from high-tax blue states has accelerated dramatically. He's putting his money where his mouth is. That speaks volumes.
I'm just saying that you're making points about the Democratic Party. What would you say about the Republican Party? You're not about to sit up here and act like they're paragons of virtue, right? And that they're always honest and straightforward. We're not going to do that, are we?
This balanced approach gives him credibility that pure partisans lack. He'll criticize both sides, which makes his critiques of Democrats more powerful. Viewers trust analysts who show intellectual honesty rather than blind loyalty.
So with that being said, is it fair to say that you wouldn't be against the Democratic Party if it represented what those Democrats represented back in the day, that your real problem is with the progressive movement that appears to have taken over the Democratic Party, and that's what you completely disassociating yourself from?
The progressive takeover is real. AOC's squad, defund the police movement, gender ideology in schools. These positions alienated working class Democrats who built the party. The realignment happening now started with this ideological shift leftward.